February 14th, 2023. It was Valentine's Day, and the world was buzzing with love. Social media was flooded with pictures of roses, candlelit dinners, and those cheesy couple goals posts. Restaurants were packed, flower shops were running out of stock, and somewhere, someone was probably crying over a breakup playlist. You know, the usual Valentine's chaos. For me, though, it was just another Tuesday. Well, almost. I was sitting in my tiny apartment, surrounded by neon green throw pillows and fairy lights that made my living room look like a rave. I know, neon green isn't exactly a normal favorite color, but hey, it's my thing. It makes me happy. Anyway, I wasn't planning anything special. I had a tub of ice cream, a rom-com queued up, and my cat, Pickles, curled up on the couch next to me. Life was simple, and I was okay with that. After all, I was still recovering from the mess that was my last relationship. Mark. Just saying his name made my stomach twist. We were together for 3 years, and let me tell you, it was a roller coaster. Not the fun kind with the loops and the screams, but the kind that breaks down halfway through and leaves you stuck, wondering why you ever got on in the first place. Mark was complicated. He was sweet at first, but then he became so dependent on me, like I was his emotional crutch. It got to the point where I couldn't breathe without feeling like I was carrying his world on my shoulders. So I ended it. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Fast forward a year, and that's when Daniel came into my life. Daniel was different. He was a doctor, which already made him seem like a superhero in Scrubs. He was charming, attentive, and had this way of making me feel like I was the only person in the room. He'd bring me little gifts, like my favorite coffee or a book he thought I'd like. He even said he loved my neon obsession, which, let's be real, is a rare find. But here's the thing about Daniel. There was something about him that didn't sit right. First, I brushed it off. I mean, nobody's perfect, right? But looking back, there were these little moments that made me pause. Like how he never talked about his family. I'd ask him about his childhood or his parents, and he'd just smile and say, "Oh, it's not that interesting." Then he'd change the subject. And then there were the questions about Mark. He seemed really interested in my ex, like way more than a new boyfriend should be. He'd ask things like, "How did he make you feel?" Or, "Do you think he ever regretted losing you?" At first, I thought he was just being curious, but now, I don't know. Oh, and the way he'd stare at me sometimes. Not in a cute, "I'm so in love with you" way, but in this intense, almost blank way, like he was trying to figure something out. Then, just as quickly, he'd snap out of it, flash me that perfect smile, and act like nothing happened. But hey, I ignored all of that. Because when you're lonely and someone comes along who seems to check all the boxes, you don't want to look too closely at the cracks. And that's how it all started. A year after Mark, on a Valentine's Day I thought would be just another lonely night, Daniel walked into my life. And everything changed. I was sitting in Daniel's dining room, trying to ignore the weird feeling in my stomach. Not from the food, no, the food was perfect. Too perfect, actually. The steak was cooked just right, the wine was expensive, and the candles flickered like something out of a romantic movie. But the room itself felt off. Everything in Daniel's house was spotless. I mean, not just clean, but immaculate. The kind of clean that makes you scared to touch anything. The furniture was arranged so perfectly it looked like no one had ever sat on it. The books on the shelves were lined up by size, and the paintings on the walls were all perfectly centered. Even the air smelled like disinfectant, not the warm, homey smell you'd expect. I tried to shake it off. Maybe he was just a neat freak. Some people are like that, right? But as I sat there, I couldn't help but feel like I was in a hospital, not someone's home. Daniel walked in with a big smile, holding a small box wrapped in neon green paper. My heart skipped a beat. Neon green, my favorite color. "I got you something special," he said, setting the box in front of me. I stared at it, my mind racing. I'd never told him about my love for neon green. It wasn't exactly something I brought up in casual conversation. "How did you know?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. He shrugged, his smile never wavering. "Lucky guess." I laughed nervously and opened the box. Inside was a set of chocolates, each one handmade and decorated with intricate designs. They were almost too beautiful to eat. Almost. "Wow, these are amazing," I said, picking one up. "Try one," Daniel said, his eyes locked on mine. I hesitated for a second. Something about the way he was watching me made my skin crawl. But I didn't want to seem ungrateful, so I popped the chocolate into my mouth. It was rich and creamy, but there was a strange bitterness that lingered after I swallowed. "Do you like it?" he asked, his voice soft but insistent. "Yeah, it's different," I said, forcing a smile. "Have another," he said, pushing the box closer to me. I didn't want to, but I didn't want to be rude either. So I ate another, and another. The bitterness was stronger this time, but I kept smiling, pretending everything was fine. As the night went on, I started to feel strange. My head felt heavy, like I was underwater. The room seemed to tilt slightly, and the edges of my vision blurred. "Are you okay?" Daniel asked, his voice calm but with a hint of something I couldn't place. "I think I just need to lie down," I said, my words slurring. Daniel's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course. You'll feel better soon." He helped me to my feet, but my legs felt like jelly. As he guided me down a hallway, I noticed he was humming under his breath. It wasn't a song, just a strange, tuneless melody that sent chills down my spine. "Daniel," I mumbled, "what's going on?" He didn't answer. Instead, he muttered something under his breath. I couldn't make out all of it, but I caught a few words. "It's almost time. He'll be so proud of me." I tried to pull away, but my body wouldn't cooperate. My vision was fading, and the last thing I saw before everything went black was Daniel's face, calm and expressionless, as he whispered, "You'll finally understand." When I woke up, everything was wrong. I was lying on a cold metal table, my arms and legs strapped down. The room was dimly lit, with a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and something else, something rotten. I turned my head as much as I could and saw shelves lining the walls. They were filled with jars, each one holding something that made my stomach churn. Hearts, livers, kidneys, all floating in some kind of liquid, each jar labeled with a name and a date. Panic surged through me, but my body was too weak to fight. My head was pounding, and my mouth was dry. "Ah, you're awake," Daniel's voice said from somewhere behind me. I turned my head and saw him standing there, wearing surgical gloves and a blood-stained apron. He was holding a scalpel, his face calm, almost serene. "Daniel," I croaked, my voice barely a whisper. What are you doing?" He smiled, but it wasn't the warm, charming smile I was used to. This one was cold, empty. "I'm doing what needs to be done," he said, setting the scalpel down on a tray filled with other surgical abilities. "You'll understand soon enough." Tears filled my eyes as I struggled against the straps. "Please let me go. I don't understand. Why are you doing this?" Daniel sighed, as if I'd asked a stupid question. "You really don't know, do you?" He pulled up a stability and sat down next to me, his expression softening for a moment. "It's about Mark," he said, his voice low. My heart stopped. "Mark," he nodded. "Mark was my brother." The room spun, and I felt like I was going to be sick. "What? No, he never mentioned a brother." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Of course he didn't. He was ashamed of me, just like he was ashamed of himself. But I loved him. I tried to help him. And then you came along." His voice cracked, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of pain in his eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it came. "You broke him," he said, his voice hard now. "You left him when he needed you the most. And because of you, he trailed off, his hands trembling. "Daniel, I didn't..." "Don't," he snapped, his calm facade cracking. "Don't lie to me. I know what you did. I know how you pushed him away, how you made him feel worthless." He told me everything. Tears streamed down my face as I shook my head. I didn't mean to hurt him. I couldn't handle it anymore. Daniel stood up, his expression cold again. "It doesn't matter. He's gone now, and he's not at peace. He comes to me, you know. I see him. I hear him. He tells me what I need to do." He looked over his shoulder, as if expecting to see someone standing there. "He'll be proud of me when this is done. He'll finally be free." I sobbed, pulling at the straps with all the strength I had left. "Please, Daniel, don't do this. Mark wouldn't want this." Daniel's eyes snapped back to mine, and for the first time, I saw real anger in them. "You don't get to speak for him. You don't get to decide what he would want. You took everything from him. Now, I'm going to take everything from you." He picked up the scalpel again, his hands steady now. "Don't worry," he said, his voice eerily calm. "It'll be over soon." And as he leaned over me, I screamed. Daniel stood over me, the scalpel glinting in the dim light. His face was calm, but his eyes were wild. They burned with something I couldn't quite describe. Anger, grief, maybe even satisfaction. "You know," he said, his voice low and steady, "Mark wasn't always like that. He wasn't always so broken." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "He was happy once," Daniel continued, pacing slowly around the room. "He had dreams. He wanted to travel, to write, to live a life that mattered. And then you came along. Daniel, please," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Don't interrupt me," he snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut through the air. I flinched, tears streaming down my face. "You came into his life, and for a while he was happy again. He told me about you, you know, how funny you were, how kind, how you made him feel like he was worth something." Daniel's voice softened for a moment, and I thought, just for a second, that he might stop. But then his expression hardened again. "And then you ripped it all away," he said, his voice rising. "You left him. You abandoned him when he needed you the most. Do you have any idea what that did to him? Do you?" I shook my head, sobbing. "I didn't mean to hurt him. I swear, Daniel. I loved him. I couldn't handle it anymore. He was—" "Stop," Daniel said, his voice cold and flat. "Don't you dare try to justify it. Don't you dare act like you're the victim here." He leaned in close, his face inches from mine. "You killed him, Emily. You might as well have put the noose around his neck yourself." I gasped, my chest tightening as his words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Do you want to know what his last days were like?" Daniel asked, his tone almost mocking now. "Do you want to know what you did to him?" I shook my head, but he didn't care. He was going to tell me whether I wanted to hear it or not. "He called me every day," Daniel said, his voice quieter now, almost like he was talking to himself, crying, begging me to help him. He said he couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. He said he felt like he was drowning, like there was this weight on his chest that wouldn't go away. And do you know what he kept saying? Over and over again. I didn't answer. Couldn't. He kept saying your name, Daniel said, his voice breaking. "Emily, Emily, Emily." Like you were the only thing that could save him. But you weren't there, were you? You were too busy moving on with your life, pretending he didn't exist. "That's not true," I choked out, my voice barely audible. "I didn't forget about him. I thought about him every day. I didn't know how to help him." Daniel laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Help him? You didn't even try. You just walked away. And now he's gone. Because of you." I shook my head, sobbing uncontrollably. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't know he was—" "Stop lying," Daniel shouted, slamming his hand down on the metal table. The sound echoed through the room, making me jump. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment before opening them again. "You know, I wasn't sure if I could go through with this," he said, his voice eerily calm now. "But then I remembered what he told me. He said he couldn't rest. He said he couldn't move on until justice was served. And that's what I'm doing, Emily. I'm giving him justice." I shook my head, my heart pounding in my chest. "This isn't justice, Daniel. This is murder." He smirked, tilting his head to the side. "Murder? No, Emily. Murder is what you did. This is redemption." He picked up the scalpel again, turning it over in his hands like he was admiring it. "You're probably wondering how I got you here," he said, his tone almost conversational now. "It was the chocolates, of course. Handmade just for you, laced with a little something special." My stomach churned as I remembered the bitter aftertaste. "A mix of sedatives and hallucinogens," Daniel explained, his voice calm and clinical, like he was giving a lecture, "just enough to make sure you wouldn't fight back. I couldn't have you ruining the plan after all." I stared at him, my mind racing. "Daniel, please," I begged, my voice cracking. "You don't have to do this. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But this isn't what Mark would want. He wouldn't want you to hurt me." Daniel's expression darkened, and he shook his head. "You don't get to speak for him. You don't know what he wanted. You didn't know him like I did." "I loved him," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Daniel froze, his eyes narrowing. "No," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You didn't. If you loved him, he'd still be here. If you loved him, you wouldn't have destroyed him." I sobbed, pulling at the straps with all the strength I had left. "Please, Daniel, I'm begging you, don't do this. I'm sorry. I'll do anything. Just let me go." But he didn't even flinch. He just stared at me, his expression cold and unfeeling. "It's too late for that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is the only way." He raised the scalpel and I screamed, the sound echoing through the room. But Daniel didn't stop. He just smiled, a cold, empty smile that sent chills down my spine. And in that moment, I realized there was no reasoning with him. No amount of pleading or apologizing would change his mind. He was too far gone. This wasn't about justice. It wasn't even about Mark. This was about Daniel, and there was nothing I could do to stop him. Daniel moved around the room with a strange, almost robotic focus. He didn't look at me anymore, not directly. It was like I wasn't even a person to him now, just a part of whatever twisted plan he had in his head. He started lighting candles, one by one, placing them in a perfect circle around the table I was strapped to. The flickering light made the shadows on the walls dance, and for a second, it felt like the jars of organs were watching me. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the fear in my chest was so real it felt like I couldn't breathe. Daniel was muttering under his breath again, words I couldn't quite make out. His voice was low and shaky, like he was talking to someone who wasn't there. Every now and then he'd pause, tilt his head, and nod, as if he was listening to a response. "Daniel," I whispered, my voice hoarse from crying. "Please, you don't have to do this." He didn't answer. He just kept working, arranging his abilities on a metal tray with the same obsessive precision I'd seen in his house earlier. The scalpel, a pair of scissors, clamps, and other instruments I didn't even recognize, all lined up perfectly, like he was preparing for surgery. And then he started humming again, that same tuneless melody from before. It was soft at first, almost like a lullaby, but there was something about it that made my skin crawl. "Daniel," I tried again, louder this time. "Listen to me. You're not well. You need help. This isn't real. Mark wouldn't want this." That got his attention. He froze, his hand hovering over the tray, and slowly turned to look at me. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and filled with something I couldn't quite name. "Not real," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You think this isn't real?" He laughed then, a short, sharp sound that made my stomach twist. "Oh, it's real, Emily. It's more real than anything you've ever known. Mark is here. He's watching us right now." He gestured to the empty space behind him, and my heart sank. "Daniel, there's no one there," I said, trying to keep my voice calm even though I was shaking. "You're imagining it. Mark is gone. He's not here. Don't lie to me." Daniel snapped, slamming his hand down on the tray. The abilities rattled, and I flinched. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment before opening them again. "He's here," he said, his voice calmer now but no less terrifying. "I can feel him. I can hear him. He's been with me ever since you drove him to do what he did." Tears filled my eyes again, but I forced myself to keep talking. Daniel, I know you're hurting. I know you miss him, but this isn't the way. Hurting me won't bring him back. Daniel shook his head, a sad smile on his face. You don't understand. This isn't about bringing him back. This is about setting him free. He's trapped, Emily. He's trapped because of you. And the only way to free him is to make things right. He turned back to the candles, lighting the last one and stepping back to admire his work. The circle of light around me felt like a cage, and I couldn't stop the sob that escaped my lips. Daniel, please, I begged. You don't have to do this. We can get you help. We can... Stop talking, he said, his voice cold and final. He picked up the scalpel again, holding it in his hand like it was an extension of himself. He stared at it for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before turning back to me. You know, he said, his voice almost conversational, I wasn't always like this. I used to believe in saving lives. That's why I became a doctor. But then Mark showed me the truth. Sometimes to save someone, you have to make sacrifices. He stepped closer, and I felt my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Daniel, please, I whispered, my voice shaking. You don't have to do this. Mark wouldn't want this. He wouldn't want you to hurt me. Daniel tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. You keep saying that, he said, his voice low, but you don't know him like I do. You didn't see what he went through. You didn't hear the things he said to me in those last days. He was in so much pain, Emily, and it was all because of you. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. I didn't mean to hurt him. I loved him. I didn't know how to help him. Daniel's expression softened for a moment, and I thought, just for a second, that I might have gotten through to him. But then he shook his head, his jaw tightening. It doesn't matter, he said, his voice hard again. It's too late for that. The only thing that matters now is making things right. He raised the scalpel, and I screamed, pulling at the straps with everything I had. But it was no use. I was too weak, and the straps were too tight. Daniel paused, his hand trembling, and looked over his shoulder again, as if he was waiting for someone to give him permission. Do it, he whispered, his voice shaky. I'm doing this for you, Mark. I'm doing this for us. I sobbed, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. Daniel, please, I begged. You don't have to do this. Mark wouldn't want this. He wouldn't want you to hurt me. But Daniel didn't answer. He just stared at me, his eyes empty. And I realized then that the man I thought I knew was gone. This wasn't Daniel anymore. This was someone else. Someone broken. Someone dangerous. And there was nothing I could do to stop him. Daniel stood over me, the scalpel in his hand trembling slightly as he muttered to himself. His lips moved, but the words were too quiet for me to hear. His eyes flicked between me and the empty space behind him, as if he was waiting for some invisible signal to begin. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the sound of it so loud in my ears that it drowned out everything else. My body was weak, my limbs heavy from whatever he drugged me with, but my mind was racing. I couldn't let this happen. I couldn't just lie here and let him do this to me. As he leaned closer, I noticed something. A scalpel on the tray, just within reach of my right hand. My fingers twitched against the strap holding me down. It wasn't much, but I could feel a tiny bit of slack. Daniel was too focused on his abilities, lining them up again with that same obsessive precision, to notice me testing the strap. I pulled slowly and carefully, trying not to make any noise. The leather dug into my wrist, but I didn't care. Pain was better than what he had planned for me. "Mark," Daniel whispered, his voice shaky. "I'm doing this for you. You'll see. You'll finally be free." I bit down on my lip, using the pain to keep myself focused. My fingers stretched toward the scalpel, brushing against the cold metal. Almost there. Just a little more. Daniel turned back to me, and I froze, my heart stopping for a moment. His eyes locked on mine, and for a second, I thought he'd caught me. But then he smiled, that same eerie, empty smile that made my stomach churn. "It's time," he said softly, raising the scalpel in his hand. "No, no, no, no." With one last desperate pull, I yanked my hand free. The strap tore at my skin, but I didn't care. My fingers closed around the scalpel on the tray, and before Daniel could react, I swung it at him with everything I had. The blade sank into his arm, and he let out a sharp cry, dropping his own scalpel to the floor. Blood seeped through his shirt, and his face twisted in pain and shock. "You," he started, but I didn't let him finish. Using the moment of confusion, I pushed myself up, my body screaming in protest. My legs were still strapped down, but I used my free hand to claw at the other strap, fumbling with the buckle. Daniel recovered quickly, his face contorting with rage. "You think you can stop this?" he snarled, lunging at me. I swung the scalpel again, this time catching him across the shoulder. He stumbled back, clutching the wound, but he didn't stop. His eyes were wild now, filled with a mix of fury and something else, something unhinged. "You don't understand," he shouted, his voice echoing in the small room. "This isn't about you. This is about him. This is about justice." I ignored him, my fingers finally managing to undo the strap around my legs. As soon as I was free, I scrambled off the table, nearly collapsing as my legs buckled beneath me. My body was weak, my head spinning, but adrenaline kept me moving. Daniel lunged at me again, and I barely managed to dodge him. I grabbed the edge of the table to steady myself, my eyes darting around the room for an escape. The stairs. They were on the other side of the room, leading up to a door that I prayed wasn't locked. I bolted for the stairs, my legs wobbling beneath me. Behind me, I could hear Daniel cursing, his footsteps heavy as he chased after me. "You can't run from this, Emily," he shouted. "You can't run from what you've done." I reached the stairs and started climbing, each step feeling like it took an eternity. My vision blurred, and my body felt like it was made of lead, but I forced myself to keep going. Halfway up, I felt a hand grab my ankle, yanking me back. I screamed, kicking out with my free leg. My foot connected with something solid, and Daniel let out a grunt of pain, his grip loosening just enough for me to pull free. I scrambled up the rest of the stairs, my hands and knees hitting the steps as I crawled. When I reached the top, I threw myself against the door, fumbling with the handle. "Please don't be locked. Please don't be locked." The handle turned, and the door swung open. I stumbled into the hallway, the bright light momentarily blinding me. Behind me, Daniel roared in frustration. "You can't escape, Emily. You can't run from this." I didn't look back. couldn't. I forced myself to my feet and started running, my bare feet slapping against the cold floor. The house was a maze, every hallway looking the same, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. I could hear Daniel behind me, his footsteps growing louder. He was faster than me, stronger than me, and I knew it was only a matter of time before he caught up. I turned a corner and spotted the front door at the end of the hallway. My heart leapt. Freedom. I sprinted toward it, my lungs burning, my legs threatening to give out. I reached the door and grabbed the handle, twisting it with all my strength. It didn't budge. No, I whispered, panic flooding my chest. I twisted the handle again, pulling and pushing, but it wouldn't move. Behind me, Daniel's footsteps grew louder. "Emily," he called, his voice sing-song now. "You can't leave. Not yet. We're not finished." I turned, my back pressed against the door, and saw him standing at the end of the hallway. Blood dripped from his arm and shoulder, staining his shirt, but he didn't seem to care. His eyes were locked on me, and his smile was wide and terrifying. "Come back," he said, taking a step toward me. "Let's finish this. It's what Mark would want." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "You're insane," I whispered. He laughed, the sound echoing through the hallway. "Maybe," he said, "but that doesn't change anything." I looked around, desperate for something, anything that could help me. My eyes landed on a small side table near the door, holding a heavy ceramic vase. Without thinking, I grabbed the vase and hurled it at him with all the strength I had left. The vase shattered against his chest, and he stumbled back, cursing. I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. If I could just make it to the road, someone would see me. Someone would help me. The trees loomed on either side of the driveway, their branches twisting in the moonlight like skeletal hands. Every shadow felt like it was moving, like Daniel was right behind me, ready to drag me back into that nightmare. What if he hurt them? Minutes felt like hours as I sat there, staring at the house. And then, finally, the officers emerged, dragging Daniel out in handcuffs. He was covered in blood, some of it his, some of it not. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unfocused. He was muttering under his breath, his words too quiet for me to hear. As they pushed him into the back of another patrol car, he suddenly looked up, his eyes locking onto mine. "This isn't over," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Mark will never forgive you." I turned away, my stomach twisting. I didn't want to see him. I didn't want to hear his voice ever again. The next few hours were a blur. The police took me to the station, where I gave my statement. I told them everything about the chocolates, the basement, the jars of organs, and Daniel's obsession with his brother. They listened carefully, their faces growing more serious with every word. "We've been looking into Daniel for a while now," one of the detectives said. "There have been reports of missing people in the area, but we never had enough evidence to connect him to anything. Until now." I shivered, pulling the blanket tighter around me. "He's been doing this to other people?" The detective nodded. "From what we've seen in the basement, it looks like he's been at this for a while. We found surgical abilities, jars of preserved organs, and personal belongings that don't belong to you. We'll need to run tests, but it's likely he's responsible for multiple disappearances." I felt sick. The thought of other people going through what I had, of them not making it out alive was almost too much to bear. Is he going to prison? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The detective's expression softened. He'll be facing multiple charges, including attempted murder and kidnapping. Given the evidence we found, he won't be getting out anytime soon. I nodded, but it didn't make me feel any better. The image of Daniel's face, his empty smile, was burned into my mind. A few days later, I was called back to the station to identify some of the items found in Daniel's basement. The room was cold and sterile, the table in front of me covered with photographs of the evidence. I recognized some of the items immediately. My necklace, my phone, the clothes I'd been wearing when he drugged me. But there were other things, too. A watch, pair of glasses, a wallet. Do you recognize any of these? The detective asked. I shook my head, my stomach churning. No, they're not mine. The detective nodded, his face grim. We believe these belong to his other victims. We're working on identifying them now. I swallowed hard, my hands trembling. How many? The detective hesitated before answering. We've found evidence of at least 5 other victims so far, but there could be more. I felt like I was going to be sick. 5 people, 5 lives taken by Daniel's twisted obsession. In the weeks that followed, the story made headlines. Doctor turned killer, the papers called him. People were horrified, shocked that someone so respected in the community could be capable of such evil. But for me, it wasn't just a story. It was my life, my nightmare. I tried to move on, but it wasn't easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Daniel's face. I heard his voice, his words echoing in my mind. This isn't over. Mark will never forgive you. I started therapy, hoping it would help me make sense of everything. My therapist told me it wasn't my fault, that Daniel was sick, that Mark's death wasn't on me. But no matter how many times I heard it, a part of me still felt guilty. I didn't know if I'd ever feel normal again, but I was alive, and for now that was enough. As for Daniel, he was locked away in a psychiatric facility, deemed unfit to stand trial. The doctors said he was delusional, that he truly believed he was doing the right thing. But I didn't care what they said. To me, he was a monster, and I prayed I'd never have to see him again. The day they officially declared Daniel unfit to stand trial, I didn't know how to feel. Part of me wanted to scream, to demand justice for what he'd done. Not just to me, but to the others. The people whose lives he'd stolen, whose families would never get them back. But another part of me, the part that had seen the madness in his eyes, knew the truth. Daniel wasn't just evil. He was broken. The court's decision came after weeks of psychological evaluations. The doctors said he was suffering from severe psychosis, likely triggered by years of unresolved grief and guilt over Mark's death. They said he wasn't in control of his actions, that he truly believed he was doing the right thing. I sat in the back of the courtroom as they read the decision, my hands clenched into fists. Daniel didn't even look at me. He just sat there, staring straight ahead, his face blank. When it was over, they let him out in handcuffs. As he passed me, he paused for just a moment, turning his head to look at me. His eyes were calm, almost peaceful, but there was something in them that made my stomach twist. "This isn't over," he said softly, his voice so low I almost didn't hear it. "Mark still needs justice." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Before I could say anything, The guards pulled him away, and he disappeared through the door. Daniel was sent to a high-security mental health facility, the kind of place where the doors are always locked and the windows are covered with bars. The doctor said he would be monitored closely, that he would receive treatment for his condition. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. I tried not to think about him, but it was impossible. Every time I turned on the news, there was another story about the case. Reporters camped outside the facility, trying to get a glimpse of the doctor-turned-killer. People wanted answers. They wanted to know how someone like Daniel, someone who had saved lives, someone who was supposed to help people, could do something so horrific. But no one had answers. Not really. A few weeks after Daniel was committed, I got a call from one of the detectives working on the case. "We thought you should know," he said, his voice careful, like he didn't want to upset me. "Daniel's been talking. I asked, my stomach tightening. "He's been telling the staff at the facility that Mark's spirit visits him," the detective said. "He claims Mark talks to him, tells him he's proud of what he did, but that it's not finished yet." I felt a chill run down my spine. What does he mean, not finished? The detective hesitated. "We're not sure. He's been vague, but he keeps saying that Mark wants more. That Mark won't rest until he gets what he deserves." I didn't know what to say. My hands were shaking, and I gripped the phone tighter, trying to steady myself. Is he dangerous?" I asked finally. The detective sighed. "He's locked up, Emily. He's not going anywhere. But I thought you should know, just in case." "Just in case what?" I asked, my voice rising. "Just in case he tries to contact you," the detective said. "Or if you hear anything unusual." I hung up the phone and sat there for a long time, staring at the wall. The idea of Daniel still thinking about me, still obsessing over Mark, made my skin crawl. Over the next few months, I tried to move on. I went back to therapy, started seeing friends again, and even got a new job. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel was still out there, watching me somehow. I started having nightmares. In them, I was back in the basement, strapped to the table, with Daniel standing over me. But in the dreams, it wasn't just Daniel. Mark was there too, his face pale and hollow, his eyes filled with anger. "You left me," he would say, his voice echoing in the dark. "You let me die." I would wake up screaming, my heart racing, my body drenched in sweat. One day I got a letter in the mail. There was no return address, but as soon as I saw the handwriting, my stomach dropped. It was Daniel's. My hands shook as I opened the envelope, pulling out a single sheet of paper. The message was short, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. "Mark still talks to me. He says you'll never be free. Neither of us will." I dropped the letter, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. How had he sent this? He was supposed to be locked up, cut off from the outside world. I called the police, and they assured me they would look into it. But their words didn't make me feel any safer. Meanwhile, reports about Daniel's behavior in the facility started to surface. The staff said he spent most of his time talking to himself, carrying on long conversations with someone who wasn't there. "He's always talking about Mark," one of the nurses told a reporter. "He says Mark visits him at night, tells him what to do. Sometimes he laughs like they're sharing a joke. Other times, he gets angry, shouting at the walls like he's arguing with someone. The thought of Daniel sitting in that sterile, white room, still consumed by his obsession, made my skin crawl. Months turned into a year, and slowly the media frenzy died down. People moved on, and Daniel became just another name in a long list of infamous criminals. But I couldn't move on. Not completely. Every time I walked down the street, I felt like someone was watching me. Every time I heard a strange noise in my apartment, I jumped, my heart racing. I knew Daniel was locked away, but it didn't matter. He was still in my head, his voice whispering in the back of my mind. And then there was Mark. I couldn't stop thinking about him, about the way our relationship had ended, about the pain he must have felt in those final days. Was it my fault? Could I have done something to save him? I didn't know, and maybe I never would. But one thing was certain. Daniel's words would haunt me for the rest of my life. Mark still talks to me. He says you'll never be free. For 2 years, I tried to put my life back together. It wasn't easy. Some days it felt impossible. The nightmares came almost every night at first. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. Daniel's face burned into my mind. Sometimes, in the dreams, I was back in that basement, strapped to the table, unable to move. Other times it was worse. Mark was there too, standing in the shadows, his face pale and hollow, his eyes filled with anger. "You left me," he'd say, his voice cold and distant. "You let me die." I'd wake up screaming, my chest tight, my hands shaking. Even when I was awake, the memories haunted me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the jars of organs, the flickering candlelight, the scalpel in Daniel's hand. I couldn't go back to my old life. The house, the city, even the people I used to know. It all felt tainted, like it belonged to someone else. So I left. I packed up what little I could and moved to a new city, far away from everything that had happened. I changed my name too. I didn't want anyone to connect me to the story. I didn't want to be that girl who survived the doctor-turned-killer. I just wanted to disappear, to start over. But starting over wasn't as easy as I thought it would be. Therapy became a lifeline for me. First, I didn't want to go. I didn't want to talk about what happened. I didn't want to relive it. But the nightmares, the paranoia, the constant feeling that someone was watching me, it was too much. I couldn't handle it on my own. My therapist was patient. She didn't push me to talk about the basement or Daniel right away. Instead, we started small. She helped me work through the guilt I felt about Mark, the questions that kept me up at night. Was it my fault? I asked her one day, my voice barely above a whisper. Did I push him to do what he did? She didn't answer right away. She just looked at me, her expression calm and kind. "You didn't make Mark's choices for him, Emily," she said gently. "You cared about him, but you couldn't save him. That wasn't your responsibility." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But a part of me still felt like I could have done more. The paranoia was harder to deal with. Every time I walked down the street, I felt like someone was watching me. Every time I heard a strange noise in my apartment, I jumped, my heart racing. I knew Daniel was locked away, but it didn't matter. He was still in my head, his voice whispering in the back of my mind. "This isn't over," he'd said. "Mark still needs justice." I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that he couldn't hurt me anymore. But the fear never really went away. 2 years passed. Slowly, I started to rebuild my life. I got a new job, made a few friends, and even started dating again. I wasn't the same person I used to be. I didn't think I ever would be, but I was trying. By the time Valentine's Day rolled around, I thought I was finally starting to move on. That morning, I woke up in my small apartment, the sunlight streaming through the curtains. It was a quiet day, just like I wanted it to be. I wasn't planning anything special, just a cup of coffee, a good book, and maybe a walk in the park. I was in the kitchen, pouring myself a cup of coffee, when I heard a knock at the door. I froze, the mug halfway to my lips. I wasn't expecting anyone. Setting the mug down, I walked to the door, my heart beating a little faster than it should have. I told myself it was probably just a neighbor or a delivery for someone else. But when I opened the door, my breath caught in my throat. Sitting on the doorstep was a small box, wrapped in neon green paper. My stomach dropped. I stared at the box, my hands trembling. It was identical to the one Daniel had given me 2 years ago. The same neon green paper, the same ribbon tied in a perfect bow. For a moment, I couldn't move. My mind was racing, my chest tightening. How was this possible? I looked around, hoping to see someone, anyone, who might have left it. But the hallway was empty. Swallowing hard, I bent down and picked up the box. It was light, almost weightless, but it felt like it was burning my hands. I carried it inside, setting it down on the kitchen counter. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely untie the ribbon. Inside the box was a single chocolate, perfectly shaped, with an intricate design on top. And a note. My heart pounded as I unfolded the small piece of paper. The handwriting was neat, precise, and all too familiar. For the sweetest person I know, you can't escape love. I dropped the note, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. No, this couldn't be happening. Daniel was locked away. He couldn't have sent this. He couldn't, unless the thought hit me like a punch to the gut. What if he wasn't locked away anymore? What if he'd escaped? Or worse, what if he'd had an accomplice all along? I stumbled back, my legs hitting the edge of the counter. My mind was spinning, 1,000 questions racing through my head. Was he watching me? Did he know where I lived? How long had he been planning this? I stared at the box, the chocolate, the note, my chest tightening with fear. The room felt too small, the walls closing in around me. I grabbed my phone, my fingers fumbling as I dialed the police. But as I waited for someone to answer, one thought kept repeating in my mind, over and over again. This isn't over. And as I stared at the box, my heart racing, I realized my nightmare might never be over.